Oui. Mais d'abord, bonjour tout le monde. Bon, vous l'avez vu, on a un bilan encore aujourd'hui qui montre que la situation est vraiment critique. On passe le cap des 1000 nouveaux cas. On ajoute 27 personnes qui sont hospitalisées. On ajoute 7 décès. Donc, s'il y en a qui avaient encore besoin de preuves que la situation est critique, là, bien, on l'a jour après jour. Et c'est pour ça qu'on a annoncé des fermetures d'activités pour réduire les contacts. Je le répète, ce n'est pas un jugement de valeur sur le travail, les efforts qui ont été faits, je pense entre autres au monde de la culture, pour essayer de limiter les contacts. Je pense que c'est une évidence quand on a 250 personnes qui se réunissent, même à 2 mètres, qu'il y a des risques. Et actuellement, il faut tout faire pour réduire la propagation du virus. Il faut prendre des décisions difficiles. Il faut que tous les Québécois aussi adoptent des nouvelles habitudes, s'habituer d'être toujours à 2 mètres des personnes avec qui ils n'habitent pas. Donc, demandez-vous pas comment vous pouvez contourner les règles. Demandez-vous comment vous pouvez vous assurer d'être toujours à au moins 2 mètres des autres personnes. C'est comme ça qu'il faut regarder la situation. C'est comme ça qu'il va falloir regarder la situation pour un certain temps. Ça ne veut pas dire... Puis il annonce beau, je pense, en fin de semaine. Il ne fait pas beau aujourd'hui, mais peut-être en fin de semaine. Vous pouvez aller dehors, mais restez à 2 mètres des autres personnes. Restez dans votre bulle familiale. C'est relativement simple, finalement, comme consigne à suivre. Donc, aujourd'hui, je suis en compagnie de la ministre de la Culture, Nathalie Roy, pour vous annoncer de l'aide pour le secteur de la culture. La ministre va vous donner les détails de l'annonce, mais c'est important, là, avant de vous parler de l'annonce, de rappeler l'importance pour notre gouvernement, pour notre parti de la culture. Rappelez-vous, quand j'ai lancé la CAQ, il y a 8 ans, 9 ans, on avait 4 documents, puis une des 4 priorités, c'était la culture. Je trouvais ça un peu dur de lire certaines choses au cours des derniers jours, là. Pour moi, ça a toujours été une priorité. Pour moi, la culture québécoise, ça fait partie de notre identité, ça fait partie de mon bonheur, ça fait partie de ce que je suis, de ce qu'on est comme Québécois. Donc, je ne voudrais pas que personne se pose cette question-là, à savoir est-ce que c'est une priorité pour nous. D'ailleurs, je pense qu'on l'a démontré dans les budgets. Depuis que la CAQ est au gouvernement, on a eu des budgets records, des augmentations records dans les budgets de la culture, puis ça va continuer d'être comme ça dans les prochaines années. Puis moi, ça m'arrache le cœur d'être obligé de prendre des décisions, là, de fermer des salles de spectacle, des théâtres, mais on n'a pas le choix. Il faut réduire les contacts sociaux. C'est une question de vie ou de mort. C'est aussi important et aussi grave que ça. Évidemment, je comprends bien les impacts, là. Puis il y en a plusieurs qui m'ont appelé, qui m'ont écrit parmi les artistes. Je comprends très bien les impacts. Donc, comme je le disais, la ministre va vous donner les détails, là, mais grosso modo, ce qu'on vous annonce aujourd'hui, c'est qu'on va rembourser 75 % des billets qui avaient été vendus l'année passée à une date ou dans le mois comparable. Donc, 75 % des revenus de billets. Donc, ça va permettre au théâtre, entre autres, de payer au moins en partie leurs artistes, leurs artisans. Ça va être comme ça pour 4 mois. Donc, du 1er octobre au 31 mars, c'est en plus des programmes qui ont déjà été annoncés. Pourquoi 4 mois? Là? J'entends déjà des personnes dire « c'est parce que vous pensez que ça va être fermé pour 4 mois. » On ne le sait pas. On est bien honnête avec vous. Là, on espère que ça sera juste 1 mois, mais j'ai été honnête avec vous depuis le début. Ça se peut que ça soit plus qu'1 mois. Par contre, contrairement, hier, on faisait des annonces concernant les restaurants, les bars. C'est pas la même chose là, dans un théâtre. On embauche des artistes, des artisans pour une saison. Donc, on ne peut pas couper ça au couteau pour 1 mois. Donc, c'est pour ça qu'on y va sur 5 mois, du 1er octobre au 31 mars 2021. L'autre raison aussi pourquoi on le fait pour cette période-là, c'est parce que ça ne s'applique pas seulement dans les zones rouges, ça s'applique dans toutes les zones. Puis là, on va s'essayer toutes les deux, Nathalie, d'expliquer ça clairement, là. Mais disons qu'on est dans une zone jaune qui a le droit à 250 personnes maximum. Ça veut dire qu'on va rembourser 75 de l'écart entre les revenus de l'année passée et les 250 qu'on a le droit. Si on est dans une zone rouge, ça veut dire que le nombre qu'on a le droit, c'est 0, bien, ça sera 75 des revenus qu'on avait à la même date l'année passée. Donc, l'écart, c'est entre
last year and this year. So total revenues last year and 0 this year. Okay, so I'm fairly certain that's clear, but I also know that Natalie will be better at explaining that than I am. 50 million in new money added to the 400 million that the minister announced in June. We're not far from $500 million in special assistance for culture. I'd like to close in telling you how important it is to reduce contacts. Lives are at stake. And not only are lives at stake, but our health system is fragile. And if we want to keep taking care of our people, then hospitalizations need to stop increasing. So that's very clear. We do want our schools to remain open. On Monday, we'll give you a summary on schools and sports as well, and nothing will be spared. So I'm counting on Quebecers. Don't wait for measures. Please reduce, please eliminate all contacts. Do not come within 2 meters of anybody unless you live with them. Now, just before closing, I'd like to say a few words on what happened with Mr. Picard and what happened this morning. I have a lot of issues following Mr. Picard. He's done this twice. A few weeks ago, he was supposed to meet with 2 people at the last minute. He canceled. This morning, he was supposed to meet with me this morning, and at the last minute, he canceled. What he tells us is that he requested that Atikamekw chiefs be with him. I looked in my paperwork and we never saw that request. Even yesterday, I spoke with Chief Paul-Émile from Ottawa. I said that we would organize a meeting over the next few weeks, and he said he was satisfied. So I really don't understand where Chief Picard is going with all of this, or why he is doing what he is doing. These meetings are crucial because, yes, racism exists in Quebec, racism against Indigenous peoples. There is racism, and we need to fight it. These recommendations come from the Vienne report. Ministers are working on this. We have a working group working on this as well. But now we need someone seated at the table to work on these measures together. So once again, I don't understand what Chief Picard is doing.
Few words in English. Good afternoon, everyone. Today's numbers show us that the situation is really critical. That's why we've closed some activities. It's urgent to reduce our social contacts. we might need to close other activities in the coming days. We have to adopt new habits. We have to always stay at 2 meters from people who don't live with us. Don't ask yourself how to get around the rules. Ask yourself how to keep your distances. You can go outside, but keep your distance of 2 meters from other people. Stay in your family bubble. Today, we're announcing new financial measures to help our cultural sector. Culture is a priority for our government. Over the past 2 years, we've announced record budgets for culture and will continue to do so. I know it's tough for our artists right now, but we have no choice. We need to reduce our social contacts. It's a question of life or death. The Minister of Culture, Nathalie Roy, will give you all the details of our announcement, but I can already say that we'll refund 75% of the tickets that would have been sold. This will be applied for the next 5 months?
Till March, the end of March.
So October, November, January, February, March. So for the next 5 months to cover all the coming season. This means that we inject $50 million more to compensate unsold tickets. This is in addition to the plan announced in June. So we won't let our artists down. Thank you. Je passe maintenant la parole à...
I will turn the floor over to Nathalie Roy, Minister of Culture. Thank you, Mr. Premier. Thank you for being here. It's very important. It's important for culture. So good day to all. My first few words are for artists who have had to suddenly cancel any presentations. To all artists in movies or preparing for movies, I understand your deception. I understand your disappointment. I'd like to tell you how substantial your efforts have been remarkable over the past few months. The curtain has fallen, it was abrupt, and it's challenging. It's now challenging now because you decided to get back into things for our pleasure. Thanks to your creativity and your efforts, you have begun fantastic new programs everywhere in Quebec and following public health guidelines. But since yesterday, this pandemic has once again required us to stop performances in the red zone. So, in order to not lose all the work that you have done, to not find ourselves without any shows over the next few months, we have decided to act strongly and to show how important culture is for us and for our province. I have additional financial support, $50 million for cultural organizations which do Quebec presentations in theatre arts, in music, in literature, and in reciting. These efforts are to compensate for any cancellations following public health guidelines and to allow for next shows to be held despite the limited number of spectators. It's a little bit of hope, allowing you to have a little bit of predictability. You've asked for it, we're giving it to you. We will compensate cultural organizations for ticket sales that will not be able to happen between the 1st of October 2020 and the end of March 2021. Very concretely, this compensation means that a broadcaster or producer could benefit from financial assistance reaching 75% of average ticket sales that they would have normally had access to without the pandemic. And if shows can only happen between or in front of a limited number, then it will compensate for that as well. To be able to have access to this money, broadcasters and producers will have to ensure us means that artists and all other workers involved in productions will be paid. So artists, authors, composers, producers, directors, et cetera, everyone will have to be paid. The $50 million additional dollars will be managed by the Arts Council for Quebec and the Cultural Development Association, the SODEC, two state-run organizations under my responsibility. I have given these amounts to these two groups. With regards to the SODEC, producers who self-broadcast their own performances, for those people, they will get rates based on what they spend. There will soon be press conferences detailing all new assistance measures when it comes to broadcasting Quebec performances. I also wanted to say that private music and movie theaters could also benefit from announcements made yesterday with my colleague, Minister Fitzgibbon, when in the red zone. For museums, we will provide them with $5 million to help museums get through this health crisis. This is a 23% increase in support given normally by the Minister of Culture, and it adjusts last June's budget. For cinemas, we are working with owners. Discussions are going well. They do promote Quebec cinema, and we will find a way to help these owners that will be very pertinent for them. Today, the $50 million given by our government is being added to the $400 million already anticipated for the cultural sector as announced on June 1st, 2020. It's a total of almost $500 million that will have been injected into culture during this pandemic. We know that shows have a huge impact on our population. These shows allow thousands of people to work and to earn a living. Any drama productions that began last July or any other work done, we have put in place guarantees to allow us to have new TV shows and to bring hundreds of artists back to the filming studio. Collectively, we need our culture and our artists so that we can continue to be entertained. That is what is going to help us get through this tough situation. In closing, thank you to everyone in culture for your collaboration. It's been exemplary. I invite you to continue to follow public health guidelines so that we can protect the most vulnerable among us. Thank you very much. Mr. Premier, we have 2 microphones for questions. 1 question per journalist, and we may be able to get a second round of questions. Cogeco Nouvelle, first question. Mr. Legault, more than 1,000 new cases today, hundreds of hospitalizations. This is the worst daily series of numbers over the past 5 months. You say you want to be honest, you're always transparent. But is it still realistic to think that we could come back to a more normal life in 3.5 weeks following what you have announced? Do we have hope there? Do Quebecers need to start thinking that things will extend beyond the 28th of October? Well, there are 2 ways of breaking this wave. There is a longer way of breaking the wave, and there's a shorter way of breaking the wave. But that requires more closures. On Monday, when I talked about sports in schools, we would do an overview. At 1,000 cases, we're starting to wonder if we will have to do more. If we want to have an impact between now and the end of the month, we might have to do more because before seeing any impacts, we have to wait 2 weeks. So we might have to add new measures very quickly if we want to have the possibility of a substantial decrease in numbers between now and the 28th of October. Is that still possible? Well, like I said, if tomorrow morning we closed everything, yes. But we're trying to find a comfortable medium, a good balance. maybe we'll have to go further. So we'll keep in touch and we'll speak again on Monday. Next question. Journal de Montréal. Hello. I don't want to correct you, Mr. Premier, but I think if we're talking about the 1st of October to the end of March, we're talking about 6 months and not 5 months? Ah, you are right, indeed. Okay, so the announcement then is that we will help cultural rooms for 6 months. Wonderful, thank you. Here's the question for Ms. Roy. That 50 million, is that only for the red zone regions or for the entire province? Ah, that's a great question. It's for everyone. Because beyond red zones, you know that we can enjoy cultural activities. Programs are ongoing. But because we don't know if the zones will change color or not, these monies go to all. And in zones where there are no shows, then it's 75% of tickets that would have been sold in 2020 compared to 2019. So it's an average, the reference here being a previous year, depending on the number of shows that you hold, the number of tickets that you sell. So if there are no shows happening, those locations will get 75% of zero of last year. You want artists to be paid. How will that work? Is it artists that had schedules that had to cancel them or that performed this summer? Well, there will be accountability because for a beneficiary to have access to the amounts, so a broadcaster, for example, there's some people more affected than others, it's what we call pluridisciplinary broadcasters, creation organizations, productions, self-broadcasters, and some events and festivals. So those groups, when they make their request, they will have to show either to the CALC or the SODEC that money will be paid. So we're going to require artists' contracts, and they will have to prove payment. We won't give them the money and ensure that they pay the entire chain so that they have access to the amounts. TVA Nouvelle. Hello to you both. Mr. Legault, Joyce Echaquan's death. Ghislain Picard preferred not to meet with you. The family is upset. We're talking about a link, a trust, some trust that is now much more fragile. How do you expect to move forward now? Well, yesterday I spoke to Ms. Echaquan's spouse. I spoke to Paul-Émile, Chief Paul-Émile in Ottawa, and I said, we need to meet in the next few weeks. Now, a working group is currently working on approaches to fight racism in the next few weeks. The Minister for Indigenous Affairs is working on measures, and there are a certain number of measures. At this point, we're talking about how to fight racism, what type of training to provide staff in hospitals and in the healthcare and education networks. A lot of work has already done around training. We need to begin the training. But I find it unfortunate that Chief Picard has cancelled twice. In the last budget, $200 million was set aside in follow-up to the Vienne report. But I don't want to start making any announcements before having the opportunity to discuss with representatives from Indigenous nations. One of the first things that I did when I was elected was I brought together the 10 nations plus the Inuit, and I asked them to tell me their priorities. Their priorities resembled those in the Vienne report. And then we wanted to meet nation by nation. After that, Mr. Picard, who is in charge of the Assembly of First Nations, what happened was I had a meeting with him, and then things were a little unclear whether there was a mandate from other nations or not. Perhaps that's why he's cancelling meetings. But we need a spokesperson. So there's 200 million to fight racism. In my opinion, that should be one of the huge priorities in the 142 priorities and recommendations from the Vienne report. Following what happened, I think we need to focus on fighting racism. And there is lots of racism against Indigenous peoples in Quebec. We need to fight, but we need to do it together. It's not by cancelling appointments that we will manage. So I find it unfortunate. It's maybe trust that wasn't established. But if that justifies a cancellation, how do you reestablish that trust? Listen, for me, it's a priority. To say that we have $200 million aside in the budget, that shows that we are interested in acting, in moving forward and doing things to correct the situation. I don't want to unilaterally decide how to distribute this $200 million. I need to talk to Mr. Picard, and I need to talk to others who are in charge of negotiating on behalf of the 10 Indigenous nations and the Inuit. Radio-Canada, with today's announcement, we're targeting assistance to organizations and assisting artists. But this is not a traditional location. A lot of shows turn solo, requiring fewer artists, fewer technicians. Do we expect to help those artists and those creators otherwise, those who didn't have contracts and those who had not had the opportunity to work because their shows were replaced by solo shows? Well, it's direct assistance, as I said, so those admissible directly. The pluridisciplinary broadcasters, creation organizations, productions, all those broadcasting. We're talking about all artists. So you're right that when you say that the shows programmed were smaller, true. But what we want to do with this is allow the sector to predict certain things. We can say over the next 6 months, you can plan for things. So plan things. We want to pay you so that you can create, so that you can hire artists. Now, even in a context where the room won't be full. So we want to compensate for ticket sales. In a regular year, for example, you would have been able to sell, but now you cannot. Okay, but we're talking about productions. We're not talking about artists without contracts. Well, in the program, there will be the opportunity for organizations to submit programming. We're asking people to submit something. Producers and directors are saying, well, I'm stopping everything because we don't know what's happening. But what we're saying is because we don't know what's coming up and because we want to fight and win against this disease, COVID, because we don't want the cultural sector to be a complete desert, we have some money to allow people to create, to develop, to mediate, and even practice in different sectors of activity. So the SODEC and the CALC will have more details to present, but we're saying create something and we'll support you. Le Devoir. Hello, Mr. Legault. With regards to the 5-6 months for this program, how can we anticipate or how can we think otherwise than thinking that things will be closed for the next 5 to 6 months? You're saying until the 31st of March. Isn't that indicative of a closure? Well, that's why I clearly said that on Monday we decided to close restaurants and bars, theaters, showrooms. And so for me, there's no difference around the duration announced. For now, we're talking about 28 days. However, for a restaurant or a bar, if they can open quickly or if they can close quickly, that's one thing. But that's not the case for a theater. When there's a play, people are hired, contracts are signed, it's a long-term presentation. So today we're talking about 75% of all ticket sales. Yesterday we were talking about 80% of fixed costs, specifically leases and rents. And to answer another question, there are federal programs as well for individuals. individuals who are in place. CERB, for example, then replaced by another program for 6 months. So what we're saying today is that we want people to feel like they have a level of predictability. That's why we're talking about 6 months. It's not because we intend to keep restaurants closed for 1 month and theatres closed for 6 months. That's not it. And about the meeting with Mr. Picard, you said that you met with chiefs from different nations, someone in Ottawa this week, and you're saying things are going well, but not Mr. Picard. Now, do you see a challenge there? Is there a personal problem? Is there an issue, something very specific with regards to Chief Picard? Well, I think you'd have to ask him that question. But for me, what I understand is that it's a question of mandate or term. In other words, when I met the chiefs from the 10 nations and the Inuit, there were a lot of topics to raise. Social housing, police, justice, youth protection, and what happened this week, it just adds to fighting racism. So each nation has its own priorities. So it's not a simple thing to work on for Mr. Picard. There are priorities from all 10 nations. There are priorities within a nation. So even within a nation, there are different communities with different priorities. But what I hope is that we can agree on the priorities of each nation. Clearly, it would be simpler with Mr. Picard representing all 10 nations, but I don't really understand why several weeks ago, at the last minute, with Sylvie Damour and Sonia Labelle, there was a meeting and he cancelled, and this morning he had an appointment with the Premier. And I would have enjoyed speaking not only about what happened in Joliette, but to follow up on the Vien report and to see how we could move forward and to see how we can continue fighting racism. But at 2 minutes to 10, he cancelled. He went to journalists, and there he said, I wanted to come with Atikamekw chiefs, but my office refused. That's not true. What we said is you can't be more than 3, and we say this to all visitors. For health reasons, you can't be more than 3. So he came with 3 Atikamekw leaders, but we can't have more than 3 people at the same time for clear reasons. That's all we said, and that's what we say to all visitors. La presse. One thing to specify, and then one question. So theatres and showrooms are locations with fixed costs. Will they be able to benefit from the announced program? Yesterday's program applies to those with no programming. So yesterday's program, whether it be for museums or theaters or theaters or halls, yesterday's program applies. So 80% of rent, taxes, insurance, etc. Okay, and then in the announcements made at the beginning of the week, they have been somewhat inconsistent. So theaters but not gyms, why malls but not museums. It seems inconsistent a little bit. Do you expect to close gyms and other locations where people gather? Well, indeed. This has been the main criticism since Monday. Why this and not this? Why not everyone? Why not this? Why not that? The goal being to reduce social contacts. If we have 250 people in a room, you walk into the room, you sit there for an hour and a half in a room, and then you leave, compared to somebody doing sports or training, and they're 2 meters apart. Well, where's the greatest risk? That's debatable. It could be debatable. But what we do know is that we have to reduce contacts. And it's not easy. In sports, it's not easy. You've got those training, you've got those doing sports. There are some contacts, some extended contacts in sports, some without. Discussions are ongoing, even at this particular moment. Discussions are ongoing. And with regards to sports, there will be an announcement on Monday. But it's not to say that theaters haven't made enough efforts and that's why we're closing them. That's not what's going on here. We're attempting to limit social contact. And other announcements are coming. And maybe those announcements will be more complicated because there are a lot of examples. The Canadian press? Around on the road and the SQ has told us that there will be some roads closed to or where drivers are being stopped so that we can discuss the possibility of travel, interregional travel. What are police officers going to do to people on the road? Are they going to send them home? What are they going to do? Well, what we said this week is that if you're in a red zone, you can't go to the restaurant. So somebody from the red zone can't go to a restaurant in an orange zone. You can go to your hunting camp if you're alone. Please bring your groceries. Don't go to the grocery store in a different zone from the zone that you live in. But what we're asking law enforcement to do is to have people respect the rules at home, respect the rules if ever there are demonstrations, and we're asking people to avoid big gatherings. And our attempts in between different zones is to say, be careful. You're coming into a red zone or you're leaving a red zone. I need Quebecers' collaboration so that we contact others as little as possible, others beyond those with whom you live. So it's to help the population. Law enforcement is not going to undertake a witch hunt. The goal is not to give tickets to anybody in any way. That's not the goal. If people continue to have parties, law enforcement will intervene, and if need be, they will give fines. So the SQ on the roads, they're just present for this weekend or for the whole 28 days? Well, we haven't specified whether there'd be more law enforcement presence over the weekend or during the week. It's surveillance. And signage will be up between regions, and that signage will remain for as long as necessary. It may remain beyond just the month. English questions now.
Sergeant de Global News. J'ai une question pour le Premier ministre et aussi Madame Roy après.
I have a question for Premier.
Could you just explain, I know you're saying you're upset a bit with Monsieur Picard, but could you explain, do you plan on meeting with the Atikamet leaders? Yeah. What are the plans there?
All right. I spoke yesterday with Paul-Émile Ottawa, one of the chief, not the great chief, but one of the chief of the Atikamek, and I told him that I would like to meet in the next week with all the different chiefs of the Atikamek to discuss about what happened in Joliette. Also, we're trying to meet since some time with Mr. Picard to discuss, yes, how do we fight against racism, but also all the measures, the recommendations we had from the Vien report. And it's not easy to meet with Mr. Picard. It's not easy for Sylvie Damour. So I thought that the problem was because he didn't want to meet the minister, but he wanted to meet the premier. So that's why I said, okay, I'll meet you. But even with the premier this morning, at the last minute, he decided to cancel. And what he said in the media is because we supposedly refuse that he be with Atikamek leaders. That's not true. He never asked for that. The only thing we said is that they cannot be more than 3, like we're saying to all the guests coming to meet with me.
Okay. And just, Madame Roy, just a clarification about the $5 million for museums. Just explain, is it $5 million for museums that have lost ticket sales for exhibits and other such things? And does it apply to all the museums, like the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Montréal and all of them?
Okay, it's a whole. It's for 112 museums, and it's $5 million that was in the plan we did announce the 1st of June. So it's to help them, and beside their regular financement. Sorry, beside their
Financing.
yes, beside their regular financing, this is 5 million we add to help them during that period. And to complete, it doesn't touch the museum who are owned by the government.
We'll take the next question.
Hello, Andrew Brennan, CTV News. I'm just going to follow up on what my colleague just was asking earlier before I get to my question. Now, I know you said earlier, Monsieur Picard, as you put it, you're not sure what games he's playing, and this is something that you've been trying to be able to create outreach, a nation-to-nation dialogue with the Indigenous community. That being said, I'm thinking back to, it seems like 10 years ago when we had the rail blockages over the winter. So before COVID, it seems like a long time, but what we got to this point, and we had the Vienne rapport. There are some things that have been, some would say, self-evident for a long time. Do you think that more could have been done, even with the difficulties meeting with Mr. Picard? Is there more that could have been done to create that dialogue, to foster a better relationship? Maybe even some would ask why the words systemic racism aren't used when we are seeing various aspects of how the Indigenous are related with and treated in different sectors of society, whether it's in hospitals, whether it's with police. There are questions there that need to be answered. Do you think, as Premier, there's something more that you could have done, particularly now that we're seeing such a tragedy happening in Joliette?
Okay. First, we've already started working on at least 50 of the 142 recommendations of the Vienne report. For example, regarding the training of nurses, for example, in the health system, what happened in Joliette, we already worked on a program. And what I would like is to discuss that with the representatives of the First Nations. So that's what I would like to discuss with Mr. Picard, if he's got the mandate to do so. If not, we're ready to negotiate with each of the nation. So we're ready to do so. Of course, I'm ready to have some meetings, but there are 10 nations, more than 50 communities. In some nations, they want us to negotiate with a few communities. So, of course, a lot of the work has to be done by the minister, not only by the Premier. But I'm ready to do some of the meetings, but of course, I cannot meet with 50 communities. So I would like, I'm a guy of results, and I'm not a patient guy. So I would like to see results. In last March 2020, we put aside $200 million for the follow-up on the Vienne report. Right now, I've got pages of suggestions from the Ministry of Autochthone Affairs, but they are waiting to get the okay from the nations. So that's why it's so important that we meet with Mr. Picard.
So my follow-up is dealing specifically with the SQ being on the roads, and we had areas where, when we were in the first wave, we stopped and did not have you did not want people going into vulnerable regions, and is this something that we could potentially see? That being said, Mr. Premier, I think it's important to ask: do you think that saying things, particularly acknowledging the systemic racism that the Indigenous community people believe that there is, do you think that's something that should be done? I know this has been something asked you already, but I feel we should ask again. Okay.
I think for me, when we talk about systemic racism, for me, it's in relation with the black people in the United States, for a reason we know. For me, I don't see that in Quebec. But for sure, there is some racism against the First Nation in Quebec, and I want to fight. I want to be the government who will do the most actions to take against racism against the First Nations.
On va y aller avec CBC News. We'll go with CBC News.
Yes, Premier Legault, I have a question for you, and of course, Minister Roy. Premier Legault, can you just talk to us about the advice you made to give to Premier Ford about the color system, and that you found it a bit confusing? We have a quote here that says, "I talked to Premier Legault about this, and he said it was very, very confusing to the public. You're constantly changing colors, and I really like where you're going." Can you explain to us?
Yeah, I don't remember saying to
this is a
Doug that
quote
it
that
was
we're saying.
confusing, but I said that it's helping. It's the opposite. I told him, I said, this system of color is easier for the people. Instead of having different rules, they understand very clearly that from the green to the yellow, you increase the measure. So what I told him is that it helped me.
Okay, so you're saying, because this is the quote that we have, he has, "I talked to Premier Legault about this, and he said it was very, very confusing to the public. I mean, you're constantly changing the colors, and I really like where we're going stage. We went through the stages, and now the hot areas, the hot spots we're working on, it's pretty clear. We have Ottawa, Toronto, and Peel. They're the hot spots, but he told me it's very confusing, and you have color changes every single day, and people are looking to what color it is today. So I think we simplify and we work on these hot spots." That was his quote.
Okay, but that's not what I said.
That's not what you said.
No.
Last question. Go ahead.
Madame Watt, can you just explain to us how this funding for the performing arts is going to help those artists and those venues who have done everything they could to keep people safe, and they feel singled out? They feel singled out.
What we announced today is really to help them, to help the theater companies, to help the artists. What we want to do, and we listen to them, that's what they asked us. First of all, they want to be compensated for their loss of ticket sales. So what we are announcing today is that we will finance 75% of the ticket sales they should have done if there were no pandemic. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay. So we want to help them, and we want to say to them, well, for those who already has a programmation, who did work, because we just have to think about all those artists who had to stop yesterday. So for them, what we are saying is we will compensate at a high rate, and keep your programmation for 6 months, because we don't know when it's going to be. We're going to be able to open again in the red zone, and there is shows in the green zone. So it's for all the companies and the artists who are working, and we are asking them, please subscribe to that program, and we want to help you.
Okay.
We'll go with Montreal Gazette.
Hello, Mr. Legault. Other cities that are other places that are experiencing a second wave, like Melbourne and Israel, are going much further than we are going here in Quebec. We're not going as far. You are not going as far as you did in the first wave. Can you explain once again what the logic is of that? We still have businesses open, schools open, and also when you talk about your announcement on Monday that you're looking to talk about schools and sports. Can you tell us, are you reviewing the mask policy, specifically kids in class not wearing masks right now? And are you talking about, or are you looking at considering shutting the schools down?
Okay. First, regarding wearing masks in schools, in classrooms, I specifically asked a few times this week to Dr. Arruda to review and see if it's necessary or not. So we are in discussion with public health. So far, we have no recommendation at this time to ask all children wearing masks in classrooms, but the studying and the discussion are going on, and we may have something new by Monday. Same thing with sports, including gyms. Regarding your other question, what was it, Deja?
What's the logic behind not going as far as the first wave? Okay, what's the logic
regarding the first wave? Okay, when we had the first wave, we closed everything. At that time, we didn't have the principle about keeping a distance of 2 meters. So that's new since last, I think, June or May. Second, at the time, we didn't have to wear mask when you're inside, for example, in a store or in public or collective transportation. So that's a different approach. So that's why I hope we won't need to close as many businesses as we had to do last spring. Regarding schools, for me, it's the last place I want to close. For me, it's so important that our children socialize and learn. For me, it's the last thing I want to close. So I'll do everything I can to keep schools open. Today, we have about 98% of our children going to school. So we have about 2% of classrooms that are closed. And I would like to keep it about this way. So as many as possible of our children, I want them to go to school.
One last follow-up question. Yesterday, Dr. Arruda was a little bit unclear about the question of people walking together outside. There's social isolation is real, mental health issues are real when we're closing down again. And many people, especially in cities, walk outside in nature just to stay healthy and sane, and they need to visit with friends and people. Is it forbidden to walk outside in forests, for instance, Mount Royal, where there are narrow pathways? Do we have to stay those 2 meters apart in those outside places?
I think to have short sentences, you can go out, but keep 2 meters from the other people. That's it. That's all. So what it means is in a park, in the large parks, you can have many families in the park, but they have to keep 2 meters of distance from the other families. That's it. That's all. Is this clear?
On va prendre vraiment 2 dernières questions en français.
2 last questions in French. Radio-Canada, TVA. Mr. Premier, hello. In English, you talked about Doug Ford's statements, who is not moving forward with the color codes because it seems confusing. Would you redo things differently if you had to? I don't recall having that conversation with him, but I'm fairly certain he said the opposite. Yes, I think it's a good idea to help the population fully understand the importance of being as close to the green as possible and as far away from the red as possible, maintaining distance. TVA Nouvelle. I know Monday you're going to make an announcement on sports. Sports federations for the next few days are entertaining activities and cancelling. There's some parents concerned. Are there things that you can say to parents and athletes very concretely today before Monday? Well, first of all, it's challenging to make a decision without consultation. And when we do consultations, there are sports federations that say that, yes, we were consulted. Financial decisions have not been made. They will be made between now and Monday. With regards to the principles, sports at school for me is very important. It's a way of motivating children to do better at school, so sports are important for me. For other sports, we have to see where 2 meters can be maintained while practicing the sport. If we talk about tennis, for example, tomorrow I'll play tennis, and I think I'll be able to play tennis 2 meters apart from the other person, and of course my partner lives with me, so. But in judo or in some other contact sports, it's quite challenging to maintain a 2-meter distance. That's why it's not an easy situation. So there's school, there's sports at school, and sports elsewhere. There are sports outside, there are training sessions. In some cases, for American football, for example, you can train and stay 2 meters apart, but it's difficult to play a football game and maintain 2 meters distance. So it's not an easy situation. We're trying to come up with some very clear guidelines for Monday. Thank you, and thank you to all. Thank you to all. Have a great weekend.